Jesus is better than my worries.
Better than my anxiety.
My worldly desires.
Better than my friends.
All of my struggles.
Absolutely everything.
Jesús es mejor que mi guitarra.
Jesus is better than my work.
Jesus is better than anything I got going on in life.
Better than my doubts.
Better than my life. Jesus is better than my struggles.
Than my insecurities.
Anything or anyone in my life.
Jesús es mejor que mi dolor.
Better than anything we think is good for us.
Better than any therapy.
Better than my future plans.
Jesus show me felicidad.
Better than my fear of being loved and accepted.
Jesus is better than my mistakes.
Better than my future plans.
To it. But we're in Hebrews chapter 11, and we are in week 3 of 3 weeks. So the good news is this is it. We're going to finish the chapter of Hebrews, and we've been talking about faith and what it looks like to believe God. And I've said this several times, and I'm going to say it. This is the last time I think I get to say it, and it's this. Faith is difficult to define in words. It's easier to define by examples. So the entire chapter 11 of Hebrews is not a definition of faith in the normal sense of a Webster's dictionary. Instead, it's a look at the lives of many, many different people throughout the Old Testament who believed God. And we get to learn what faith looks like by their example. So faith is easiest to define by example rather than by definition. We've looked at Abel and Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses' parents, and Moses. Okay? And now we're going to turn our attention to the latter part, and we're going to focus on Moses again, the children of Israel, Joshua, Rahab, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, and Samuel. And if there's some people on that you didn't even know were in the Bible, don't feel bad. If you're looking at that list and you're like, who in the world is Jephthah? That's a great question. We'll talk about it in just a few minutes. So let's begin in verse 24. We left off here last week. We'll pick up right where we left off. Verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Verse 26. Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. Moses, by faith, chose affliction with God's people because he knew who he was and he knew to whom he belonged. And we called this last week, we finished with this one, identity-defining faith. In other words, as I trust God, as I put my faith in God, I begin to know and to understand who I am. My own identity becomes clear in the fog of life when I'm trusting in God. God brings clarity in the darkness. God brings clarity in the fog. And we talked about this and we looked at this last week. But there's another element to this that the writer of Hebrews speaks about. And that is this idea that he suffered for his decision. In other words, believing God doesn't always mean that it's going to go your way, whatever that way might be. It might not go the way we were hoping that it would go. In fact, if you consider the world today, the world is a very dangerous place to be a Christian in many places in the world. I know we can talk about how hard it is in America, but let's be honest. So many places in the world today, you're killed for being a Christian. Not mocked or put down or belittled, but you're killed. And in fact, we are told that the last year of 2018 was one of the bloodiest years to be a Christian on a global scale. And so we recognize that for many people, the decision to follow Jesus is not just a simple one of, well, that was fun. I like those people. I like their music. I'll go to their church and, oh, sure, I'm going to be a Christian. No, for many people, the decision to associate with Christ is a death sentence. But they choose it anyways. And the question is how and why? And so there's two quick things I want you to consider about Moses here in the verses that we just read. Number one, how could Moses esteem the reproach of Christ when he never knew Christ? The writer of Hebrews says that he esteemed the reproaches of Christ. Moses never knew Christ. He lived far before him. And then number two, how could Moses esteem the reproach of Christ as greater riches than the treasures of Egypt? When Moses chose to identify with God's people rather than with Egypt, He connected himself to Jesus. He didn't know that he was doing that, but the writer of Hebrews says that's exactly what happened. At the time, Moses wouldn't have been aware, but just as Jesus suffered for identifying himself with sinners, Moses suffered for identifying himself with Israel. Jesus let himself be connected to sinners in the same way that Moses allowed himself to be connected to Israel. But here's the real question. How in the world could Moses be willing to suffer, really truly suffer deeply, when he had the right to the treasures of Egypt? In fact, the question is more like this. Why couldn't he have just had both, right? Why couldn't he have gotten all of Egypt and been a great witness to God about, for Israel? And I think about this, and I think it was easy for me to make a decision for Jesus. And let me know if you guys can resonate with this. It's not like I had a bunch of riches to give up. I'm not looking at you and saying, just give up all of your riches and follow Jesus. Most of us are like, cool, I got like $50 in a bank account, I'm good. Most of us don't look at our life and say, oh man, I had to give up a lot of my worldly possessions in order to follow Jesus, right? Moses had everything. And when I say everything, it's not metaphorically, I mean literally. The historian Josephus, who lived he was very present in the 70 AD time period. He was born after Jesus, but he lived at that time. He wrote, and he says this, that Moses was the next in line to the throne of Egypt. That he was the chosen prince. Whether that's true or not, we have no idea. And when I think of Moses giving up the treasures of Egypt, now that's a big deal. But most of us probably didn't give up very much. Have you ever heard that phrase, you married up? Right? Guys, it's true for all of us, right? They look at you, they look at her, and they go, wow, you married up. Okay? And it's also true, we could say it like this, we married up and we got saved up. Okay, does that make sense? We married up and we got saved up. We definitely got the good deal on the salvation issue. It's not like you can say, man, Jesus, you really need to pull your weight because I'm doing my parts. It's just not true, right? God's given everything, all the treasures that we have, that we inherit in Him. But I want you to consider this. Even though I didn't have anything of great value, maybe you didn't have anything of great value, what you did have, who you are, what is a part of your life, matters to you. So it might not be rich in the world's eyes, but what it is matters to you. It might be trash, but you see it as treasure. And this is the dilemma that so many people have today. Oh, I would love to come to God as long as I could keep this thing. As long as I could keep that terrible character element in my life, as long as I could keep that, I'd love to be a Christian. No, you're going to have to give that up. God's going to change you. I don't want to give that up. You're going to have to give that up. Oh, I don't want to give. It might not be valuable in the world's eyes, but if it's valuable to you, then that is your treasure. And so Moses gave up real treasure. You and I might not be giving up treasures the world sees, but it might be something that is of value to you. Hebrews doesn't tell us that if you trust God, then everything's going to go great, right? The Bible never gives a kind of a false, it's not a pep talk book. It's meant to be very real and very much in the real world. Let me put it like this. A life of faith may experience pain, loneliness, betrayal, and suffering. I hate that statement, by the way. But there's truth to it. And if that's what it looks like to trust God, then maybe I'll hold out for a better deal, right? But let me just remind you of what it looks like to live a life without faith. Let's put the next slide up. A life without faith may experience pain, loneliness, betrayal, and suffering. The reality is this: life brings pain, loneliness, betrayal, and suffering. Can I also remind you that it brings happiness as well? And it brings joy, and there's peace. It might be a different season that you're in right now, but you don't have the right to say it's the only season you've ever had. The very fact that you've experienced loneliness is because you know what it's like to not be lonely. You can't say I'm lonely unless you know what it's like to not be lonely. You can't say you're discouraged unless you've known what it's like to not be discouraged. Friends, you and I go through valleys because we know what mountains look like. Otherwise, it'd just be a plain. But there's valleys and there's mountains. It's just logical. If this life is all that we have, then we might as well get everything we can out of it, right? If this life is all you got, then you got to get everything you can. So how could Moses choose to suffer with Israel when he had all the rights of Egypt? Really simple. You got to use different math. You got to use different math. You see, if this life is all we have, then get everything you can. That's good math. But if this life is not all that you have, if there is an eternity, then you need to reaccount. You need to do the math a little differently, don't you? If you've only got 80 years on this life at best, then you better get everything you can. Squeeze it and get as much as you can. But if you have eternity, then you got to use different math. And the different math looks like this. Am I going to play on a temporary team, or am I going to play on an eternal team? Am I living for a temporal goal, or am I living for an eternal goal? And this is how I would describe it in Moses' life. Moses saw eternity. Faith looked like this. He saw eternity. So yes, he saw that he was going to suffer with Israel in the moment. But Moses had eyes that allowed him to see beyond this moment. He had eyes that allowed him to see into the next life. He had eyes that allowed him to see into eternity. How can you and I see into eternity? Simple. It's by faith. You have to see the eternal by faith. That's not where it ended for Moses. Look at verse 27. By faith Moses forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Moses understood the reality of Pharaoh's retribution, but there was a greater reality working in his life. Moses looked to God, who is greater than Pharaoh. And so I would put it like this. Faith sees God in this life, not just in the life to come. Sometimes we have this mentality as Christians, it's like, oh no, there's nothing good in this life, there's nothing about, it's just all about heaven, it's all about heaven. Nonsense. Jesus said, I have come to give you life and that more abundantly, right now. You and I were meant to experience God in our lives today, now. Now maybe you're not experiencing God right at this moment, but you and I, by faith, have the right to experience and to see God. You need to see God working in your life. If you only see the events of your life without God, you will be defeated. If you see the events of your life with God, you might be discouraged, but you will never be defeated. You might feel upset, but you are not without hope. You have to see the difference. Verse 28, by faith Moses kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. So Moses gave a command about keeping the Passover, and he did it in faith. And if you remember what Passover was, it was this night when God said to Moses, and Moses passed it on to the people, you're to take a lamb into your house, every single home. 1 week earlier, you're to bring this lamb into your house. It's to be a part of your home. And after 7 days, I want you to kill that lamb. I want you to take its blood, and I want you to sprinkle it across the doorpost, up and down and across the side. And then the angel of death is going to come, and if the house has blood upon the doorpost, then the angel will pass over that house, and you will be spared. And it was a picture of the cross on the sides and across. It was a picture of the cross. And let me put it like this. Moses here, in our context, he had faith in the power of the cross. Moses had faith in the power of the cross. When the angel of death passed over, there was this proof that what Moses was told to give to the people was true. I just want you to imagine how much faith it took in that day to do this. Moses comes to you and he says, listen, I need you to take a lamb into your house and then kill it after a week and then put its blood on the doorposts. Do you have any idea how much faith it would take to do that? And you're asking your neighbor, are you going to do it? I don't know. Are you going to do it? I don't know. I think we should probably do it. There's been frogs everywhere, like Moses said, so I don't know, maybe. It's crazy, though. What is he? I don't understand this. I don't know. Here's the thing. The cost of not believing was the death of your firstborn. And so I'm sure at some point you're just kind of like, you know what? Let's just find out. It's better, listen, it's better to find out, it's better to try, it's better to believe than to not believe and lose your child. Okay? But do you have any idea how much faith it would have taken in that moment? In fact, let me just suggest something to you. It's a whole lot easier today to look back at the cross and see what Jesus did and understand why it was necessary and how it was accomplished. It's so much easier to look back at the cross than it would have been to look forward to, okay, we'll kill an animal and we'll put its blood on there, but we don't know if it's anything real. Do you have any idea how much easier it is today to look back and to say, okay, I am guilty. Whether it's a lot or a little, it's irrelevant. I'm a guilty person, and God has offered a way of salvation through His Son. How much easier is it for me to put my faith in Him? Would you really be willing to put your eternity in question? That's the issue. It's not the death of a firstborn, it's your death, and it's my death. Would I really put that into question? Is it really worth it to me to not believe in Jesus, to not follow after Him in this life? Am I willing to put my eternity at stake? Would I put the eternal at stake for the temporary, or will I put my temporary at stake for the eternal? That's the question. Look at verse 29. By faith, they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. Man, this is a tough one for me. This is interesting. When the children of Israel went through the Red Sea, it took a lot of faith and it took a whole lot of courage. They walked on dry land with walls of water built up on either side of them. Now, I watched the cartoon. I've seen what happened. Right? By the way, in the cartoon, it's like there's whales going by. It's like, what sea are they in? This is crazy. But could you imagine what kind of courage it would take when the waters part? And by the way, it wasn't muddy ground, we're told. It was dry ground. So the water moved and it dried immediately. And we're told that they walked on. You know what it takes? Two things. It takes courage and it takes faith. It takes courage and it takes faith. By the way, one is not enough. The Egyptians had courage. Do you know how much courage it would take to follow after a bunch of people that walked through a giant gaping hole in the water? Like, who was the first Egyptian in? He's like, you go first. Nah, you go. I'm right behind you. Step in there, you're like, it worked. It's good. A little bit further, it worked. And then the next one, and the next one. Then everybody comes in, and we know what happens. The walls come crashing down, and they all drowned. What changed between them and the children of Israel? This is what faith looks like in our lives today. It's this. It's faith in God's sustaining power. That the walls around you will not close in until God is finished with you. That's what it takes to have faith that will get us through this life. It said, I believe in God's sustaining power. Now, you can believe that God gives peace, but if you are not going after God's peace, then you will not experience God's peace. In other words, you could say to me, oh, I believe that God can give peace. Are you going after God's peace in your life? You could say anything you want, but the only way to know if it's real or if it's true is that you go after it. We want to go after the things of God, not just say we know that they are true. I can't imagine what it would have been like to have walls of water and you're just going through it. And the whole time you're just like, I don't know, I think, here's what I would be doing. You'd be like laughing at the beginning, but it's like a nervous laugh. And then you're crying like, oh my gosh, this could end really bad. And imagine this, all of your family, all of your possessions, everything is on the line. If you're wrong, your family dies. If you're wrong, you lose everything. Are you willing to put your faith in God like that? That you are willing to trust everything to the Lord? I was thinking, every time I think of this story, I think of the day Joy and I got married. It was a while ago. And I remember when she was walking down the aisle to me, and she's walking with my father-in-law, her dad, and he was praying the entire walk down the aisle. It's a really long aisle at Calvary, Costa Mesa. He's just praying. I think he was praying in tongues. He was praying. There was a lot of prayer happening. It was like happy. He seemed happy. He's like, yay, yay. And then he seemed to be like, dear God, what am I doing? It was both. And I always think of the children of Israel when I think of this. Like the waters parted and they're going through and I'm watching my father-in-law. He looked happy and then he looked a little bit concerned. Then he looked deeply concerned. And then happy again and then concerned. I think we finished it concerned. I'm pretty sure. Right? Could you imagine having that courage to walk through that water wall and trust the Lord, to believe God? I would put it like this. I've always called it this. It's called gratitude and terror simultaneously. Gratitude and terror. Gratitude. What is happening right now? Yay! Terror. What is happening right now? It's the same sentence, same question. It just comes with a different phrase, right? We can trust in Jesus because he's holding everything together. Colossians 1:17 says this, he existed before anything else, and he holds all creation together. Your life, your story, your future, your present, he's holding all of it together. He's holding all of it. Verse 30 of Hebrews 11. Verse 30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. After a long exodus of the people, they came into the land of Canaan. They came to the city of Jericho. It was the most fortified city in the land of Canaan. I want you to imagine this. The first city God takes his people to was the most fortified. And it's either genius or it's stupid, right? Here's how it could be stupid. You take your people who are untested in battle and you take them to the hardest battle they're going to face. But here's how it's genius. If God is victorious, there's no city in Canaan that will stand up against them now. If the strongest falls, everything is going to fall. And so God sends his people to the strongest city, and they gather and they get the marching orders. And literally the marching orders were to march. They walked around the city for 6 days. One time, walked around it. 6 times, 6 days. And then we're told on the 7th day they were to march around the city 7 times. And they were to do so quietly. Their biggest job on the day that God was going to bring victory, the biggest job that the people had was to keep going like this. Shh, shh, to all the kids. Kids, quiet. Everybody be quiet. God said to be quiet. Why? I don't know. Do it anyways. But this is not how you win battles. I know. I'm not sure God knows what he's doing, but it's okay. Let's do it anyways. Shh. And they march around. And then finally, at the end of the 7th one, they're told to shout it out as loud as they can. Scream and shout and just go for it. And we all know the story. The walls of Jericho came crashing down. And what do we learn about faith? It's this. The children of Israel showed us what faith looks like when faith does not make sense. Can you believe God even when it doesn't make sense? Abraham did when he was a 100-year-old first-time dad. A 100-year-old first-time dad. Peter believed God when he stepped out of a boat and he walked on water. That does not make sense. But here's the thing. God's sense is greater than my sense. Why not trust his sense? You might say, well, it doesn't make sense to do this. It doesn't make sense to try this. It doesn't have to make sense. It might make sense to God and not make sense to you. The question is this, can you trust God? Can you believe God? I put it like this, and we'll put this on the screen. Why would I live life by my limitations, the limitations of my own sense, my own power, and my own abilities, when God is inviting me to live by his sense, his power, and his abilities? Why would I choose mine when I can have his? Verse 31, by faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe, when she had received the spies with peace. Just prior to the destruction of Jericho, the spies went in and they went to the house of a woman named Rahab, and she hid them, she protected them, she believed with all of her heart that God was going to give the land to Israel, and she did not want to suffer the same fate as the rest of the Canaanites would because she believed God. By the way, Rahab, we are told in the Old Testament, there's a word used there. It's the word prostitute, but it can also be translated innkeeper, which makes us all a lot more comfortable on Sunday morning. Problem with the New Testament. The writer of the New Testament said it was not innkeeper, she was a prostitute. Back to uncomfortable. Rahab was a prostitute who, when God came crashing into her life, she chose to believe him and follow him for the rest of her life. She was a traitor to the gods of Canaan and to the people of Jericho because she chose Yahweh. In fact, I would describe her faith like this. Rahab shows us that it's faith. Faith is an allegiance to God above everything else. Faith is an allegiance to God above everything else. In fact, she would say this: He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. This is faith. It's to choose an allegiance to God above your government, above your culture, above your desires, above your hopes, and above your will. It's allegiance to God first and foremost. Look at Matthew 10, verse 37. It'll be on the screens. I won't. You don't need to turn there. Jesus said this: He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Jesus calls us to an allegiance to him. Does Jesus really expect me to love him more than anybody else? Yes. Why? Because if I love him more than anybody else, I will properly love everybody else. See, if I choose to put other people or myself before God, I will love in an unhealthy manner. And I've said this to you before, and it's still true. You ready? If I am left to myself to love myself, I will love myself to my own demise. If a little bit of chocolate is good, what's better? More and more and more, right? We'll just keep going. You and I will love ourselves to our own demise. But what is the check in us that will allow us to love people in a healthy, proper way? That check is simple. It's this: love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. If you put God first, you will have a love for others and for yourself and for your family and for your friends. You will have a healthy, well-balanced love. So when Jesus asks you and me to have an allegiance to him above all else, please understand what he's doing there. He's putting your life into proper balance. He's putting your life into proper balance. Here's how, this is not a word, but it was the best way I could describe it. There is a love out there that can become selfish or stocky-ish. Stocky's not a word. Stocky-ish is not a word. Right? You have these people that they love somebody so much and then they just become creepy. Right? And you and I can love ourselves so much, we can love somebody else so much that it becomes a selfish love. It's not a real sentence or word, but you won't forget it now. I can love someone in a selfish way that makes me feel better about myself, but is unhealthy. I can love someone in such a way that makes it's for me. Oh, but I just love you. No, the real sentence should be, I love me and I need you. But God's love allows us to love in a way that is healthy, in a way that is proper. Look at verse 32. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak, Samson and Jephthah, there he is, if you didn't know who he was, and also of David and Samuel and the prophets. Okay? Here's the problem that the writer of Hebrews is having. There's just too many people to get to talk about. And so he does this it's like he spent a whole bunch of time on some people, and then God's like, it's time to move on to the next thing. And he just says, okay, here's a whole bunch of people, and I want you to learn lessons about faith from each one of them. Men and women who exemplify faith. Instead of dissecting each one of these people separately, he gives us kind of some idea of what each one of them looks like. Gideon. God had to jump through tons of hoops to prove himself to Gideon. You remember Gideon? Gideon's the one that said, well, God, I don't know. Well, God, I don't know. Well, God, I don't know. Barak is the guy who was so scared to go into battle that unless the woman Deborah would go with him, he would not go. He was too afraid. Samson. I don't think I need to say a whole bunch about Samson other than this guy was really flawed. He was really flawed. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, read it. It's a great story. He was a strange guy, but God used him. Jephthah. If you don't know who Jephthah is, don't feel bad. Most of us don't. Jephthah is a random character in the Bible. Here's his story. He's the one who won a great battle for God. But before the battle, he said this, God, if you will bring me victory, then whatever walks out of my house, I will sacrifice to you. I don't know what the dude was thinking. What walks out of his house? Is he keeping chickens in there? I don't know what he was thinking. Whatever walks out of my house first, he comes back from the battle, and guess what? His daughter walks out first. Yay, Dad! And he's like, oh no. He makes promises to God. Listen, can I remind you of something? God didn't ask him to make that promise. Sometimes we want to hype things up. God, if you do this, then I will do this. And let me just say, you're not going to keep your end of the deal. You and I are not going to keep our end of the deal. God didn't ask us to keep. There's no deal for you to keep. God's gift is that he's already done it all. It's not a negotiation or a bargain. God's already finished it all. And so Jephthah is a crazy example of a guy who wants to be all bold and serious and committed to God, but he makes foolish promises that he could never keep. When it says that he sacrificed her, it doesn't mean that he killed her, but that he sent her away. He put her away like in a convent type of a thing. Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel. They remind us of this about faith. Weak faith is better than no faith. Weak faith is better than no faith. I think a lot of us can look at this list of all these people and say, man, they were amazing. They trusted God. They are awesome. Wow. And then you get to the end of it and you're like, yeah, that's not me. And so God has the writer of Hebrews put a whole bunch of people in there that utterly failed, and yet God was still faithful. Their faith was weak, but listen, weak faith is better than no faith. Even if you feel like you're not inclined to a life of faith, you can be one of God's men and women of great faith. The Bible doesn't say you've got to go find faith. The Bible says God's given to each one of us a measure of faith. You've already been given the ability to believe. You just need to choose to focus that ability on God. You've been given the capacity to believe. You just have to choose to focus that capacity on God. There are no perfect people, only flawed people. But God uses flawed people. God uses flawed people in his story. You might say, oh, I could never be like Moses. Yeah, nobody can. But could you be like a flawed person in the Bible? Yes, you can. In fact, I'll say it like this. I'll finish the thought with this. You are not too flawed for God. You are not too flawed for God. I make you fill it out because I want you to emphasize that word not. You have to know it. You are not too flawed for God. Verse 33. Through faith they subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. Out of weakness they were made strong. They became valiant in battle. They turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. What a list of achievements here. It's amazing. They subdued kingdoms, Hezekiah, Josiah, David. They stood for righteousness in times of depravity. Daniel is mentioned for stopping the mouth of lions. The writer talks about those that were thrown into the fire, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were thrown into the fire by Nebuchadnezzar because they chose to never bow down. In fact, they said it like this: if God wants to rescue us from the fire, he can, but if God does not rescue us, we still will not bow down to you. That's faith no matter what. Here's the question that as we come to the end of this, that you have to ask yourself. Are you willing to believe God as a negotiation? God, if you do this, then I will believe. Or are you willing to believe God, period? And then, no matter what happens, you just see what God's going to do. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, Lord, we're going to believe you no matter what. And if you rescue us from the fire, great. If you do not rescue us from the fire, great. A lot of us would say, Lord, if you rescue us from the fire, I'll believe. If you don't, I'm going to be mad. But here's the problem. You're still going to heaven one way or the other. I guess you get to heaven angry. You die and you're like, God, never mind, whatever, it's fine. No, tell me, what'd you want to say? Nothing, this is perfect, I'm good. Oh, you want to go back? Would you like to? No, I don't want to go back. It all disappears over just in a moment, right? Triumph and victory. I'm probably never going to face a lion. In fact, I'm really hoping that I'm never going to face a lion. But did you notice what else he said in that list? He said that out of weakness, many were made strong. I'll bet you that'll describe you and me. Isn't that amazing that he would say that they stopped the mouths of lions and weak people were made strong? I don't feel like the two are the same. But they are in God's kingdom. When you choose to believe God, even though you are weak, God will bring great victory. The triumph of faith is not that you believed, it's that God worked through your life. That's the triumph of faith. Verse 35, others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trials of mockings and scourgings. Yes, in chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were slain by the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in dens and in caves of the earth. This tone changes dramatically. It gets very dark. It gets very serious. People who were tortured. It's a shocking transition. And that feels so distant from the life that I'm living and the life that you're living. And we all have to consider, what kind of faith do we really have? Do I have a faith that could withstand, or that could withstand the darkest and most difficult moments? And he says that these people did it for a better resurrection. And in John chapter 5, you can look at the screens here, Jesus said this, don't marvel, the hour is coming in which all who are in the graves will hear his voice and they will come forth. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. Sorry, it's not up there, but I want to remind you of this phrase, the resurrection of life. There is a resurrection coming for all who have put their faith in Jesus. Regardless of what this life looks like, there is hope in the life to come. There's hope in the next life. Even if you were to live a life that is just filled with torture and pain and suffering, something nobody would wish upon anyone, the writer of Hebrews reminds us, you can do so for the hope of a better resurrection. Verse 39 and 40. And all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. All of those who suffered and lived through tragedy and trusted God, they did not receive the promise. What's the promise that the writer is speaking of? It's the promise of the Messiah. Those Old Testament saints, they were looking forward to something, but you and I, we're looking back at the promise of the Messiah. Jesus has already come. Think of the prophet Isaiah, ready to be killed. He's written about the coming Messiah. He knows about the Messiah, and he trusts that what God said is going to happen. But we have the promise backwards. We get to see the promise and say, it's true. We know it's true. The weight of evidence on the side of who Jesus is overwhelming. The number of people who truly chose to suffer and die for Jesus, it's an overwhelming amount of people that say, I will believe no matter what, so that you and I can today say, I will believe no matter what. I will trust God no matter what. I'm going to finish with this thought. This is the challenge of faith. The challenge of faith is this. It's not, is it true? Because it is true. The challenge of faith is this. Will you believe God? Not just for salvation, but for sustenance, for the ongoing need that you and I have for God. Will you trust God, not just for your salvation, but for the rest of today and for tomorrow and for the rest of the week and for the rest of your life? There needs to be in us, or what God's trying to build into us, is a faith that can keep going. Now, you might say, I want to. Yeah, I'm going to do it. And again, I don't want to pep talk you. It doesn't work like that. Because the Bible tells us that God can take weak people and give them strength. So know where you're at, see where you are, and choose to believe God. God, today, I'm weak. Today, I'm weak. I'm going to trust you. You see, if you believe God, you'll know who and where you are. You'll have clarity of who you are. So you can look at your life and you can say, okay, this is the season I'm in right now. I don't like it. Or maybe you're in a season you say, man, I love it. Let's just stay here, Lord. I'm going to believe you through victory. Maybe you're not in victory and you say, I'm going to believe you through trial and through difficulty. Know the season that you're in. How can you know it? By faith. If you've got the clarity of who God is, you will have clarity of who you are. He is the perfect lens by which to see who you are. Don't let other people tell you who you are. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. Let God tell you who you are. Be identified with Jesus so that you can have faith through whether it be the valley or whether it be on the mountaintop. Faith in the promises of God. Faith through the valleys that we go through. Faith that can sustain through it all. Faith that allows me to be weak but experience God's strength. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to close by taking communion. We'll worship some more and we'll take communion. And here's the beauty of getting to take communion at the end of a service like this. And I'll invite the worship team to come on back up. Here's the beauty of taking communion at the end. Taking communion, okay, so we're going to come down. We got them in the front and we got it in the back. Here's the thing about communion. Communion is me saying, I believe that Jesus' body was broken so that I could be healed. And I believe that Jesus' blood was shed so that I can have my sins forgiven. But imagine this, when you stand up, just imagine this. Okay, we do it as tradition because we've become so accustomed to this, but I just want you to think about it, and I want it to have a different meaning to you today when you stand up. When you stand up, you are admitting that you are weak, and unless you are willing to grab hold of these elements, there's no salvation apart from Jesus. You're acknowledging that apart from God, there's nothing. So when you stand up, we don't stand up like bold as much as we stand up and we say, I recognize that I need God. And that's what causes us to be able to worship Him in a unique and a fresh way. It allows us to say, I believe God, even though I'm weak, even though I'm broken, I'm going to trust God. I'm going to trust God through my own difficulties. I'm going to trust God through my own issues. I'm going to trust God when everything is going great. I'm going to trust God. And so, Father, we thank you so much for the reality of how good you are, Lord, to us. And I pray, Jesus, that as we come into worshiping you, God, I pray, Jesus, that you would be real to us. I pray, Father, that our hope today would be in you. I pray, Father, that our confession of faith would be this. If it wasn't for you, Jesus, we'd be nowhere and we'd be nothing. Not out of a point of discouragement, Lord. That's not discouraging. It's incredibly wonderful, Lord, to know that my salvation and my life is not totally dependent upon me, but that I can be rooted and found in who you are, God. So as we take communion, Lord, we do so with humility and with joy, knowing that our sins are forgiven because we're broken people who need you. Pour out your Spirit as we worship you and as we partake in communion. Thank you so much for being with us today. We really pray that the ministry of Calvary San Diego is strengthening and encouraging you in your faith. We would love for you to download our app and share your story of how God is working in your life. Also, if you would like to invest in the ministry of Calvary San Diego, you can financially partner with us by visiting our website at calvarysd.com/give. Thank you so much and have a great day.